Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with a preview of our Classics Today Insider feature, Adrian Boult's 10 Best Recordings, which you can see if you are a ClassicsToday.com Insider subscriber. If you aren't, please consider whizzing over to ClassicsToday.com and subscribing on our homepage, or you can do it through the link below this video in the description. And it's a great opportunity to see this feature, this ongoing feature that I'm doing of conductors' 10 best recordings. And we're going to be doing more than conductors. We're going to be doing pianists and violinists and orchestras and ensembles and golfers and tiddlywink players and everybody's 10 best recordings. And it's going to be really cool, so you're going to want to be an insider to follow it. In any case, this week our featured artist is Adrian Boult, the British conductor who lived to be like a million. Actually, he lived to be like 93. I think he was 93 when he passed away. He was born in the 1880s. You can do the math. He made recordings up until the late 1970s, 1980, I don't know, somewhere in there. Really a remarkable career in more ways than one. And I would like to talk a little bit in this preview about the kind of conductor that he was and how his career, particularly his late career, became possible. We can do it very simply if we look at his complete recordings for EMI, which is now Warner. It's really rather fascinating because they were all boxed up. And if you look at these boxes, I mean, he recorded for a bunch of other labels. He made recordings for Everest and for Westminster. And, you know, he popped up in different other places. Lyrita did stuff with him too. But essentially, the vast majority, first we have, let's see here. We have this large Vaughan Williams box. It's nothing but Vaughan Williams. And then we have an even larger Elgar box. Look at that. It's nothing but Elgar. And then we look at these little skinny suckers. One little skinny sucker is Bach to Wagner. The other little skinny sucker is Tchaikovsky to Gershwin. Yes, Gershwin, really bad Gershwin. It's the Cuban Overture. It's the most horrible performance you've ever heard. But this is not a terribly large repertoire of things that we would consider to be the international standard canon of classical music. There's particularly very little Beethoven, and this actually has like 4 discs of Holst. So that doesn't count. That goes into the British pile. So really, it's kind of fascinating. He made his reputation playing contemporary, 20th century British music. Now, he was lucky in one respect. 20th century British music is fabulous, and it's tonal, and it's attractive. But the reason it is something that we need to consider. This is really, I think, an incredibly interesting story historically. And it's based on the fact that music history, as it has been taught to us over the generations, is just wrong. It is totally incorrect the way we are taught the history of music works. It is winner's history, written, you know, with the virtue of hindsight. It's the worst kind of history. It's not even real history. It's bullshit history. But musical history, as we are usually taught, goes something like this. Well, there were like Bach and Handel and a lot of Baroque people. And when the Baroque period ended, classical music, the classical period got going, and it got going with Haydn and Mozart, and then later Beethoven and Schubert. And in the 19th century, when all of the concepts of nationalism and nation statehood really got roaring, those composers became the linchpins of the German classical school, the school of Schumann and Mendelssohn, and then Brahms and Wagner. And Wagner wrote Tristan and Isolde, which was very chromatic. And because of that, the later composers from Strauss on became more and more chromatic until tonality finally collapsed under the weight of its own inertia. The house of tonality came crumbling down, only to be triumphantly supplanted by the second Viennese school of Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern, who in turn gave birth to modern music, the avant-garde, the academic serialists, and all of that stuff that we all hate to listen to, or most of us do. I mean, there was some great music written in that style, of course, but the majority of it was just horrible. And, the majority of music in any era is probably not so great, but this was even by that standard, was really terrible. And so that is the history of music as it's generally taught. I think you can see that essentially, because the field of musicology, the concept of musicology, was largely a German scholarly endeavor. I mean, it was the Germans who did complete editions of Handel and Bach and Palestrina, all the Renaissance composers. They subsumed musical scholarship into the German historical story that led through the Viennese classics and Beethoven to the German Romantics to the Second Viennese School, and that is what we were taught music history is, or the history of classical music, which is, of course, as we know, the only kind that these people think matters. The fact that there's lots of other music that matters is never obtrudes upon their notice. So it's really a very fascinating lie that we've been fed, because the reality is, of course, it wasn't like that at all. In the real world, there has always been, the majority of music has always been tonal, vocal, song-oriented, whether it's classical or not, even the classical stuff. Along at the same time, tonality was collapsing and all that horrible stuff was going on. I mean, you had Puccini, you had the Debussy and Ravel, you had, wonderful, wonderful music being written outside of the German-speaking world. You had the Russians, you had Tchaikovsky and Shostakovich and Prokofiev writing fabulous music, sometimes because they had to for political reasons, sometimes because that was the style they were working in. There was always a multifarious array of styles, and it is absolutely incorrect to maintain that the German style is the better style, is the true style, is the more sophisticated, anything. Those kinds of comparisons are invidious. They really are, because great music is its own justification. And great music is great music. That is music which somehow achieves a certain depth of perfection in its construction and quality and whatever qualities it espouses, as long as they're really good ones, that it's a great example of its kind. And one great example of its kind is not better than another great example of its kind somewhere else. So what really happened, what really happened, is that there was a German school that had a fairly continuous history, although there are German composers who don't fit terribly well into that continuous history, like Hindemith, for example, or Franz Schrecker, or Korngold, the late Romantics who did not dive off the cliff like the rest of the lemmings into the atonal maelstrom. There were always a few of those. There was Karl Amadeus Hartmann, who was fabulous. I mean, heavens, there was Karl Orff, So there was always more going on, even in Germany. But the historians don't want us to know that. And the musicologists don't think that those people matter, because they were not necessarily innovators. They weren't innovators in the way that German musicologists defined innovation, which is almost solely in terms of harmonic process and very little else. But of course, there's a lot more to music than that. There really is. And one of the places where the lot more to music than that was happening was in the UK. And of course, that was because the UK was behind everybody else, which had its advantages and its disadvantages. The disadvantage was that it was behind everybody else. You know, the United Kingdom was the land that music forgot. All of their music was imported. And it didn't really get going as a native force until Elgar and the turn of the 20th century. But after that, oh my, what wonderful things started happening. It became one of the great national schools of 20th century music. I mean, think of all the fabulous, fabulous British composers. You know, you have Britten and Walton and Tippett and Vaughan Williams and Elgar and Bax and oh goodness, there's just so many. The Bridge and Bryan, or just the Bees alone are just a fabulous list of people. Really wonderful, wonderful composers. What made it possible to have all these composers? What made it possible, and the second lie that we're often told, is that they had orchestras. It was the rise of the modern symphony orchestra. You know, in the classical period, for all that we admire Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven and those people, orchestral music was the exception. And abstract orchestral music was really the exception. I mean, Haydn was so remarkable because he had a prince who had his own orchestra who turned him loose and let him do what he wanted. And there were other composers who wrote for aristocratic, establishments who had similar opportunities to write tons and tons of effectively private orchestral music. But as the 19th century wore on and royal patronage declined, orchestras had to become public. They had to become municipal. They had to be completely different organizations. And the existence of these orchestras in all of the towns in Germany and elsewhere created the opportunity for composers to write fabulous orchestral music. And it's really very interesting. It's very ironic because at the time that orchestras were getting established, which is from about the 1880s on, I mean, the two oldest modern type orchestras were the Vienna Philharmonic and the New York Philharmonic. And they were both founded in 1842. Effectively, that's when their orchestral public concerts got going. It was 1842, but after that was much later. The Berlin Philharmonic is younger than many American orchestras. It didn't get started until the 1890s or so. The London orchestras are younger still. It wasn't until the 1900s and 1920s that they got going, and most of them got going because of Thomas Beecham, who founded the London Philharmonic, the Royal Philharmonic, and privately financed it. The Philharmonia Orchestra was financed by the Maharaja of Mysore under the organizational wizardry of Walter Legge, the EMI producer. So orchestral music is a relatively recent phenomenon, modern orchestral music. And if you build it, they will come. These orchestras existed. They wanted to perform music by native composers. Some of them did anyway, not so much in the United States, I guess, but they did in England because Europe went through this whole nationalist thing. And most of the time, nationalism is just horrible. It's vile. It's despicable. It's bigoted and culturally blinkered and disgusting. But culturally, it can be very interesting. It really can be because it forced composers to search for new materials, to pour new wine into old bottles and say fresh and new things while still retaining the attachments to the values of musical greatness that they'd come to learn, which were, of course, German values almost everywhere except in places like Italy and France, which had such powerful and long-lasting independent national cultures of their own that it was only much later that the avant-garde, wackiness started to infect their musical cultures with people like Pierre Boulez or Luigi Nono or Bruno Heinz Yaya. Well, no, he was the Hoffnung festivals, but it's the same thing, right? So Adrian Boult, remember him? He's the topic of this discussion. He got his pedigree in Leipzig, like everybody went to Leipzig to study how to write lots of fake Mendelssohn and Brahms. And he became a conductor under Arthur Nikisch, the famous Arthur Nikisch. And he came back to England and he conducted the world premiere of The Planets, and then he worked for the BBC, organizing the BBC Symphony, which was a new ensemble then, as an orchestra trainer, and then he retired at the age of 60, and it was only after that, for the most part, I mean, he made a few recordings before then, but that he had this marvelous, what they call an Indian summer of his career as a passionate advocate of 20th century British music. And he became, because of all of this nationalist ferment and the foundation of the orchestral culture, let's call it that, one of the first ever conductors who made his reputation in recordings, on recordings, doing not the German standard repertoire. He did some of it. And we're going to talk about that in the Adrian Boult's 10 Best Recordings video. He did do some of it. But think about it. He never recorded a Beethoven cycle. Sure, he played that music. With the BBC, he did contemporary music from everywhere. I mean, he recorded Hindemith's Symphony in E flat. He recorded Shostakovich 6. He did Mahler 1. He did a lot of music, and he did a lot of contemporary music. But essentially, why we listen to him today is because he was one of the very greatest conductors of this repertoire, Elgar Vaughan Williams, and because of his long life and his relationship with those composers who he knew, which gave his interpretations an authoritativeness that hasn't waned one bit. And I think this is a very, very interesting story. And so I really hope that you will take the time to subscribe to Classics Today Insider if you have not, and watch the 10 Best Recordings of Adrian Boult. It's going to be a very, very interesting list, and one that's going to offer marvelous opportunities for you to encounter some music that you probably aren't too familiar with. And that's a great thing. So thank you for joining me, friends. Keep on listening. I'll see you over at classicstoday.com. Take care.